Martin's house was, for reasons he'd always avoid explaining, hidden away in a dense patch of woodland. Lewis had found it quite by accident some years ago on one of his solitary walks into the wilderness, where he'd found a heartfelt, albeit inevitably sinister welcome, along with the vague instruction to come back on Christmas Day. So he had, and since that first visit he'd made it a tradition to visit old Martin each Christmas. The truth was, neither of them had anyone else to pass the holidays with. Martin was a hermit who'd lived by himself for decades, and Lewis, sadly, had no one left anymore. The house was back. Its lights cut through the faint woodland mist as he drew closer. Lewis moved at speed, a heavy rucksack full of supplies hanging in his hand and making his arm ache. He envisioned the log fire inside and a glass of the brandy he'd brought with him, which would drive out the wretched December chill he'd been wading through for the better part of 2 hours. Hopefully there would be at least a dram left for the frozen night to follow, though judging by past visits, he doubted it. Martin must have sensed his coming in that way he always did, for he found the door standing open.
"Morning,"
Lewis called as he stepped through the door, closing it behind him, setting his sack down, doffing his shoes and hanging his coat upon the rickety coat rack nearby. "Morning, lad," Martin said, stepping into the hallway from the kitchen, wherein the smells of roast dinner twisted Lewis's empty stomach harshly. "You're early this time."
"I think I've memorised the route at last. No wrong turns and masses of thistles to deal with this time."
The old man laughed, doubtless remembering his only friend stumbling through the door last year, jeans torn to ribbons and with a dozen bleeding scratches requiring the iodine. It was not, Lewis reflected, one of his better Christmases.
"Anyway," he said, "I come bearing gifts."
Reaching into his bag, Lewis extracted the gift-wrapped brandy bottle and a box of toffees whose like Martin had spoke fondly of more than once.
"Merry Christmas, sir,"
he said, putting the gifts in Martin's pale hands. "Much obliged, young one. Sit down, tell me the news. How have you been keeping since last year?" Talk of his yearly doings, such as they were, translated to complaints about the rut Lewis found himself in, scraping by with an unfulfilling job, and living out of a rented hovel, with a boiler which looked fit to explode any day. It made for a poor subject of discussion on Christmas Day, so Martin soon took up the reins of the conversation, and was telling one of his innumerable tales. This one about how he once found the severed remnants of a downed Heinkel bomber's tail stuck in the branches of a tree. Supposedly he had taken it home, scratched off the rancid paintwork, melted it down and turned it into a watering can that wound up being too large to be practical. It was a ridiculous and pointless story, and whether it was true or not could only be guessed at. However, the way Martin told it, with just the right balance of dramatic flair and earnest sincerity, made it a fine yarn to listen to, like all the old man's odd stories. The day passed in the pleasant and all too swift way in which they often tended to. Dinner was a proper home-cooked roast that put Lewis's own typical efforts at cooking to shame once again. After that, the two men downed the brandy, and then another bottle Martin had stashed away in his store cupboard. In short order, they were both drunk, which made the singing which followed, the yearly tradition, a fairer thing to their own ears. In the back of his mind, Lewis registered that the sun would soon be setting, and once it was gone, the visit would be over. It was a sobering thought, and one which couldn't help but rob some cheer from his singing voice. Martin cast a weary look out of the window at the gathering dusk, and stood up to stretch, then fell back into his armchair. "I dare say we have time for one last song, or most of one at least." Without waiting for any kind of reply, he immediately burst into a rendition of Good King Wenceslas, and soon Lewis joined in. They reached the start of the second verse just as the sun vanished altogether. Suddenly, Lewis was singing by himself in silence, sat in the lightless remains of an ancient broken house. The fire was out, the windows were shattered, the wind was whistling all about him, and the friend he had been singing with was now a lifeless skeleton in a rotted chair. Reaching for his phone, Lewis switched on the built-in torch and brought some light to the lightless scene. There, on the far wall, scoured into the wood, was the message he'd found when he'd first stumbled upon this house. "Come back on Christmas Day." written with sharp-edged, angry letters which now, by meagre torchlight, resembled the threat it most assuredly was not. "Old hands and an older life on an oak wall," Martin had told him once. Not easy, not easy. He dared not turn the torch on Martin himself. Such a fear of skeletons was thoroughly illogical, he knew. His own skeleton would probably tell him the same if it was ever asked for an opinion on the matter. But that was a conviction he could only maintain in the daytime. Behind his eyes he could not banish the thought of a horrendous laugh and two bony hands reaching for his throat. Martin would probably swat him upside the head to hear of such a silly fear. But there it was all the same. Lewis crept to the rucksack he'd left by the now fallen door. From it he pulled out his sleeping bag and two battery-powered heat lamps which would keep him from freezing to death until dawn. A dawn that was about 15 hours away. This part of Christmas was never easy, and he knew he really should make his way back to his car, parked some 2 miles away, whilst there was still light to see by. Martin only had the daylight hours of this one day of the year to spend on Earth, however, and though he'd never come right out and say it, stubborn and stoic fellow that he was, he dreaded the thought of spending the time alone. He'd spent 67 Christmases by himself before he'd met Lewis, and a great many more before that in life he'd also spent by himself, falling into an isolated slump from which he never recovered after the death of his wife. This long loneliness was a state which tore at his soul year after year, and most likely consigned him to this lingering state in death. Lewis hoped he could be free of it one day and pass on, assuming that's how such things really worked. But in any case, every year he arrived as close to the dawn as possible, and stayed until the sun went down to provide some company to the long-suffering old man. Then he waited through the uncomfortable night and went home on Boxing Day. It was a small sacrifice to make, all things considered.